Hi, welcome to the second designer diary that we're recording in preparation for the upcoming ARCS campaign. We're going to do this one a little bit differently, just because we're still trying to figure out how to adapt my long, winding designer diaries into some kind of video form. You're getting me here in our sunroom next to the piano because Matt wants to film every corner of my house, and I'm going to let him. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the process of writing for games, the difficulty of finishing games, and how those things shaped both new foundations and the upcoming ARCS campaign. Okay, so let's talk about game writing generally. When I work on games, I always keep a detailed journal of my thoughts and also to-do lists. Really, they're more like commonplace books. They're places where I blow off steam, talk a little bit about some design struggles I have, and mostly keep a track of what I plan on completing by the end of the week. When I was working on ARCS, I took a little detour and wanted to read other journals that were written during the creation of big projects. So I read Jordan Mechner's Prince of Persia diary, and I was really struck by it. I mean, it's kind of an irritating read because on the one hand, he is a precocious, like ex-Ivy League grad who thinks he's going to change the world. But once you warm up to that, it was interesting to see how he spent time to actually explain what he was diarying about. Certainly when I journal, I don't explain anything. So when I approached the ARCS journal, I really took strong efforts to describe what was actually happening in my personal and professional lives during that project. Made it a lot easier to reference later. All of the designer diaries I write, they come from this process of writing about a game. And usually what happens is as I'm writing, sometimes I will encounter interesting design problems or places where I find myself sort of trying to take the project to account. I want to find a way to describe what I hope to be doing. Those little nuggets become the designer diaries that are later published. Now, designer diaries, for me at least, are usually written at the very beginning or the very end of the design process. I don't really talk about the final stages of development. I don't really have time to. However, in the case of ARCS, I think this is a really key moment. So the first thing you should know about ARCS is that we've been working on it for a really long time. The very beginning of the design was started in 2020, basically weeks after we finished work on Oath. This was kind of an unusual thing. Sometimes when you finish a game, you find yourself immediately pulled into the next game, despite the fact that you're feeling pretty tired. Now, as with any project, I started a design journal. In the first draft, I think it's one of the first entries for the ARCS design journal, I described it as a pulpy, Oath-ish game. I wanted to lean into the fact that the game had a roguelike progression that would be a strategy game rather than an adventure RPG framework. Now, early in that scope document, it was really clear how large the project was going to be. So for instance, I knew I wanted every player to have the choice of 2 different fates when they started the game. I knew it was going to be a 4-player game. So that meant 8 fates. And if the game was going to be 2 sessions or 3 sessions, that I was really working in multiples of 8. By the time we got to the final stages of development, the idea of writing 48 plots for ARCS seemed like a dream at best. This was simply too big of a design for just one Kickstarter campaign. Sometimes when we work on a game, we want to expand it because we need expansions to realize the full scope of the project. You simply can't do it in one wave. And if you do half of the project and then nobody wants it, then you probably shouldn't finish it anyway. We want to open ourselves up to that possibility. So as we approached the midpoint, or like we approached the end of the ARCS project, we realized that we had far too much material to actually take through development. This actually had a very funny consequence when it came to hiring our interns. I made the argument that instead of just having 1 or 2 interns, we should actually hire a brace of totally fresh interns who would just be ARCS testers. My thinking was that if we had this group of people testing ARCS, it would help Josh and I just focus on the design and development that remained in the game. And maybe if everything lined up perfectly, by the end of the summer, we would have all of the design fully tested, fully developed, ready for final layout. This didn't go this way. And it didn't happen this way for a few reasons. One of the biggest problems was that we didn't cut things. If a plotline wasn't working correctly that summer, we put it on life support, or we tried to repair it in one way or another. Now, partially this was necessary because we were painfully close to the minimum viable product. I thought we have space to do 24, maybe 36 fates, and we had to really keep things at that 24 plot line as a minimum. And by the time we got to the end of the summer, it was clear that we had missed something. We were nowhere near finishing the game. During this time, I gathered the kind of wider creative staff and all the members of ARCS, of course, into a meeting where we wrote down everything on whiteboards and tried to figure out how much work was actually in front of us. It's kind of a simple pointing exercise. what we try to do is guess how many days of work it will take to finish each component. We made a big old list of all the different PDFs essentially that we'd be submitting to the factory, and we scored each one, first based on how much design work was remaining, second based on how much layout work it would take to get print ready. And of course, if there were needed illustrations, we would note that as a blocker too. I went into this meeting thinking that maybe we needed an extra couple weeks, maybe 3 weeks of time. It turned out that we needed about 10 to 12 weeks of extra work in order to get all of ARCs done. And we did the only thing that we could do, which is we started dividing up the tasks. It's difficult to capture the feeling of this work because the end is in sight and everyone is doing what they're trained to do, which can feel wonderful, but we are all staying late every day. It was very common for Patty and I to be the ones turning off the lights in the evenings and also turning them on in the mornings. I would catch Josh in the testing Discord on weekends. I would try to, gently reprimand him and tell him he should take some time off. But he and I both knew that that reprimand was a little performative. We both wanted to be there. We wanted to be making the game better. You never want to have to depend on these kinds of sacrifices. They're sort of part of the creative work. And you also want to make sure that there's space to recognize people who are doing fantastic work. I think sometimes because of all the discourse around what gets called crunch culture, we can sometimes overcompensate and kind of overcorrect for what is being in the thrall of inspiration and feeling yourself pulled to some really great task. It sounds maybe romantic, but I think that the work that we do, our labor, is one of the most valuable things that we own and is the source of great joy. I mean, vocation is such a powerful, even kind of beautiful idea. When people want to work, when they show up, when they bring their all, I think that that can be a really beautiful sight, but it's also a place of vulnerability, and you should never put yourself in a position where you're taking advantage of it. If as a publisher, you're ever depending on these kinds of sacrifices to make your schedule releases possible, I don't think you should be in the business. I think you're doing something pretty reprehensible. Now, every product I've ever worked on has had hectic moments. What we try to do generally is recognize when we're getting behind schedule and just allow ourselves to slow down a little bit. So this is why we are so happy to delay a project. If you ever see us post about a delay, know that we are delaying because we don't want to crunch. I don't want people working 16-hour days. Now, when it came to the actual finishing of ARCs, one of the things that made it possible is that Josh and I started cutting things pretty dramatically. During those last few months, we dropped a whole mode of play, this kind of prequel game that we were experimenting with. We dropped tons of leaders, fates, guild cards, lore cards. These drops were strategic. We were realizing that every little part of the design had dev liability with it, and we had to control for those liabilities. But with ARCs, the core architecture was so strong, and some of the narrative conceits were so compelling that Josh and I, we couldn't quite find ourselves just wanting to scrap this stuff. So instead, we were tossing it in these little folders. Basically, we were kind of making an archive of all of these rejected or incomplete ideas. Now, part of this was just a recognition of the fact that we knew that if we had more time, we'd probably be able to make it workable, but we didn't have more time. It's also important to mention that even though we were cutting things, it didn't feel like a full retreat. We were actually doing some of the most innovative design work in all of ARCs in these last few sections. So let me give a small example. When we were working on ARCs, we initially did not really know how to talk or think about fates. So in the initial rubric, I used an entirely dramatic conceit. I said, look, if a story is a 3-act story, then it's an A fate. It's an origin fate. If it's a 2-act story, then it's a B fate. And if it's a 1-act story, kind of like a simple dramatic conceit, then it goes in that final category. This worked well, but it didn't give us any of the mechanical structure that we needed to actually design a fate. Now, when we were working on ARCs, we gradually realized that we could use a mechanical framework to understand how these fates work and to guide their development. And the framework's pretty simple. If you're building an A fate, the fate is about introducing a new system into the game and then eventually unlocking a special scoring system that only you have access to. For B fates, they work similar to A fates, although the system changes are a little bit smaller, a little narrower, and in addition to unlocking a scoring system for you, you're also unlocking a scoring opportunity for the rest of the table. Classic example is the pirate fate, which you are going to get a special scoring condition in that third act, but there's also the possibility that your trove is going to get discovered by the other players. In other words, more scoring for you, but potentially more scoring for the table. Now the sea fates, in contrast, are spoilers. They're heals. So they have access to a kind of third way of scoring, a brand new system of scoring that is going to dramatically upset the rest of the game, but that scoring doesn't really lend itself to power generation in most cases. This mechanical framework, which we did not come up with until the last 2 or 3 months of ARCs, was extremely powerful, and it allowed us to create things like the Gate Wraith in basically a long weekend, whereas other plotlines took months and months of work. So all of this cutting worked. We found ourselves basically meeting our internal estimates. People were starting to go home on time, and we had the general sense that this was going to be a project that we were going to finish. Still, it was going to be tight. Now, usually I work pretty hard to avoid what I'll call like an artificial deadline. So the classic one is always Lunar New Year. People are always trying to get things into production before Lunar New Year. For us in our releases, we mostly are worried about Gen Con. And if you're going to have a game that you want to release at Gen Con, it's best for you to have it at the factory by December. By the time I uploaded some of the last files to the factory in December, I was tapped out. I don't think I had ever been that exhausted at work before, and I know that was true for the rest of the team as well. The entire experience of finishing ARCs was a visceral lesson in our own limits. We worked really hard to extend time and to build protections for everyone on staff. I didn't want anybody, losing sleep or pulling an all-nighter, but we had still been working constantly for 3 months with minimum breaks just to make it all happen. We all did the only thing that you could do at that point, which is we took some time off. Now in January, as we got back into the office, I started working on what would become Oath New Foundations. This was an experimental project. I didn't know that we were going to be doing Oath next. And if I'm starting a project, I'm going to do what I always do, which is I'm going to open up my word processor and I'm going to kick up a new document. But maybe it was muscle memory. For whatever reason, I turned on the old ARCs diary. It was just the file that I booted up out of habit. And I found myself looking at an entry I had written on December 18th. I don't really remember writing this entry. It must have been literally right after I submitted the last file. It contained, in addition to kind of the mundane facts of the day, an outline for an expansion for ARCs. And basically it outlined a small expansion that would have more material for what we think of as ARCs' base game, as well as descriptions of 12 new plot lines. And I wrote at the bottom that, if I started the expansion, I think that we could probably have it through development in about 6 months. And if we wanted to have it slated for 2024, maybe it could happen. If I were to show you this outline, it would not look anything like the expansion that we are going to be offering you all. It wasn't like I had some vision or something. That's ridiculous. The thing that is important about the outline was not that I called my shot. It's that even in the construction of the outline, you can see a change in my tone. If you look at early ARCs journal entries, I am in an aspirational, kind of ambitious mode. I'm kind of writing about all the things I want the game to do. But in this final entry, I am so sensitive to scope. All of these elements are not only listed in a priority from how hard to how easy I think they're going to be, they also have dependencies in them and little things that I would want to test, different approaches to how we can think about the process of actually building this thing. A few days ago when I was writing this and thinking about what I wanted to talk to you all about, I actually went back and read the early Oath New Foundations journals, and you can see the style carry over almost seamlessly. Those early Oath journals, though they are aspirational, though they are, trying to imagine the best thing that we could possibly build, are also so interested in like how you actually construct a project that big. They are dividing up the different what I thought of as modules of the expansion, the components that we would need to be able to make the Oath expansion work, into the smallest chunks they could. I even had different staff members flagged who I thought would be very good as helpers on the different Oath projects. This attempt at structure actually was borne out very nicely in the development of Oath New Foundations. Oath New Foundations was a massive project. It took a little longer than we had planned for a bunch of reasons, some of which we planned for and some of which we didn't. But broadly, the project stayed under control. We didn't have any wild work sprints. Everyone did a fantastic job. And even though we had to take a couple of delays, I never felt like those delays compromised the work that we were doing. People stayed on task. I also was very happy with the scope of the project. Look, if I'm being honest, I've never really liked project managers. I've never really liked project management. I find it kind of anathema to the whole creative process. And that's because I want to open myself up to the possibilities of a project. I don't want to be caring about whether or not we're going to be able to deliver at the end of the quarter. I want to be thinking about what is the best thing that we could possibly make. But in those early Oath journals, in the late ARCS journals, there was this recognition that if you want to build things on the scale that we want to build them, then you have to find ways to fold in those processes. You have to think about how you can open yourself up to the possibilities of project management without just trying to crank out, X number of widgets every quarter. When I look back at my creative work over the past decade, what I see is a evolving process. I'm still trying to figure out how to talk about games with you all. I'm still trying to find new ways to be transparent about our processes and also new ways of building even larger things. There aren't very many people who work on games of this size, and I want to try to find a way to do it in the most responsible and sustainable way possible. At the same time, I want to make sure that our games stay a little wild. So both ARCs and New Foundations were places where we got to experiment with a new way of structuring our projects. And we started structuring our projects not just thinking about their completion, but the completion of the game afterwards. Sometimes in interviews, people will ask me about the game I'm working on next, and I always tell people, and I mean this earnestly, that I imagine no future when I'm working on a game. I am working on each game with the morbid realization that it's the last one I got. And that's a fine way to create things, but it's not a good way to run a studio. And so you have to find ways to actually imagine that the game might be successful and that people might want an expansion. And ARCS was the very first project where we allowed ourselves to entertain the possibility that people might want us to do more ARCs. Instead of that thought being presumptuous or feeling like we were jinxing ourselves, it actually opened things up. Because when Josh and I, when we were working on those plot lines, we would realize that we had good ideas that we didn't have time to finish and that we'd be able to return to them later. And that means that we can build a much bigger and a much better world. I don't want this project to balloon out of scope. And so we're going to this expansion really just looking at what we think we can accomplish this year. And we're going to be held accountable to it. We're going to be talking to you throughout the process. If things get delayed, you're going to know when they're delayed about as soon as we know that they're delayed. And our hope is to ask ourselves, what does it look like to work on ARCs in a more limited fashion and to just fashion the next brick, the next part of what we hope will be a big multi-year story. And so next week, we're going to talk a little bit more about that. I'm going to take you through all the stuff in the new expansion. As we go through all the elements, I'm going to talk about the parts of the game that are done, the parts that feel like they need more work, and the parts that are fully exploratory and might even get cut. And we hope that that openness will give you a sense of how we're changing our approach to this work without sacrificing some of the transparency that we think of as foundational to the work we do. Our crowdfunding campaign for ARCs is going to launch in less than 2 weeks. If you want to be part of that campaign, you should follow us now. Okay, that's fine. I just need to start talking because podcasts are easy. I don't have to look at anything. Little did everyone know, I was closing my eyes during every podcast appearance.